Today I'm going to tell you the story of Mark Reynolds, a man who thought he knew the woman beside him, until a single folded piece of paper changed everything. Mark Reynolds was 42 years old. He had worked in the same industry for nearly 2 decades, built a comfortable career, and taken pride in being steady. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't reckless. But he was reliable, the kind of man neighbors trusted and colleagues respected. At home, he carried the quiet dignity of a husband of 15 years and the pride of a father whose son was growing into a young man with his same sharp eyes. On most evenings, life at the Reynolds household followed a familiar rhythm: dinner at 6, dishes done by 7, and afterward a mix of television, reading, or checking in on homework. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe, and Mark, after years of effort, believed he had built a fortress against the chaos of the world. But sometimes the cracks in a fortress don't appear with a storm or a fight. Sometimes they come with something as small as a receipt. It was a Tuesday, the kind of night that should have been uneventful. Laura, his wife, had asked him to grab the car keys she'd left in her purse. Nothing unusual about that. She was rushing upstairs, hair tied back, muttering something about a late meeting she'd had the night before, and she wanted to settle in quickly. Mark walked into the living room, reached into her bag, and sifted through the usual mix of a wallet, a perfume bottle, and pens. His fingers brushed against something out of place, a crisp, folded slip of paper. He pulled it out without thinking. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but the bold black letters at the top froze him in place. Hillside Bar and Grill. Mark knew that restaurant, not because he had ever been there, but because it was the kind of place couples went to for celebrations. Upscale, pricey, known for candlelit tables and bottles of wine that cost more than a week's groceries. It was on the other side of town, far from the office where Laura claimed she'd been working late. His eyes traveled down the receipt line by line. 2 entree, 1 bottle of wine, dessert for 2. The timestamp told its own story last night. The exact hours Laura said she'd been in a late meeting with her team. Mark felt time slow down, his pulse echoing in his ears. He read the numbers again and again, as if maybe he had misread the ink. But no, there it was. Clear. Unforgiving. It wasn't just the dinner. It was the details that didn't add up. Laura had always said she avoided wine during the week, claiming it made her sluggish in the mornings. She was disciplined about that, proud of it. Yet here it was, a shared bottle of wine, paid for in her name. He folded the receipt back exactly as he'd found it and slipped it into the pocket of her purse. His hand found the keys, and he went about his task. But everything about that simple movement, walking outside, pulling the car into the driveway, dragging the trash bin back to its place, felt weighted with a meaning he hadn't invited into his life. When Laura came back downstairs a few minutes later, smiling casually, hair damp from a quick rinse, she asked if he wanted to watch their favorite show. Her tone was easy, her laughter natural, and Mark said yes. But inside, he wasn't listening to the television, or even to her voice. He was listening to something else, the first sound of doubt echoing inside his chest. That night he lay in bed, eyes open in the dark, staring at the ceiling while Laura scrolled through her phone beside him. The receipt replayed in his mind like a clock, ticking louder and louder. He didn't confront her. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. But in that silence, a seed was planted. A man who once believed his marriage was unshakable now carried a folded slip of paper in his memory, a paper that whispered that his fortress wasn't as strong as he thought. And for the first time in 15 years, Mark Reynolds realized he could no longer trust the comfort of routine. Something was off. Something was hidden. And from that moment on, he would never look at his wife the same way again. At first, Mark tried to push the receipt from his mind. One dinner could mean anything, he told himself. Maybe she met a client. Maybe a coworker had insisted on treating her to a drink, and she picked up the tab. He built small explanations in his head, stacking them like bricks to seal away the unease. But once a crack has been made in trust, no amount of patchwork can restore it to what it was before. Within days, he began to notice changes, subtle at first, but sharp once he allowed himself to see them. Laura's routines were shifting. She left the house earlier in the mornings, heels clicking a little faster across the tile. Her clothes seemed chosen with more care, dresses he hadn't seen in years, New blouses that hugged her shoulders differently. Colors that weren't her usual muted tones. Even her perfume had changed, something sweeter, heavier. The kind of scent that lingered in the air long after she was gone. Mark remembered the way she used to toss on whatever was closest when heading to work. More concerned with deadlines than appearances. But now, mornings stretched out with her standing before the mirror, brushing mascara across lashes he'd never thought needed enhancement, lipstick in shades he'd never seen her wear at home. He noticed it all, even as she laughed off his compliments with a distracted wave, saying she just wanted to feel put together. At first, he accepted it. People evolve, styles change. But then came the late nights. Laura claimed she was buried in projects at work, meetings that stretched beyond regular hours, deadlines that couldn't wait. She returned home long after dinner, sometimes with a flimsy excuse about traffic or an emergency email that kept her tied up. Yet when she walked in, there was a brightness about her, a glow that didn't fit the story of a woman drained by spreadsheets and boardrooms. Her laughter rang sharper, like it belonged to someone stepping out of a comedy show, not a business meeting. Mark started to notice her phone, the way it seemed glued to her hand, face angled away from him, screen tilted downward. Sometimes she smiled at it, a quick curve of lips that seemed too private, too intimate to belong to an office thread or a group text with friends. And when he stepped into the room, she flipped it face down, sliding it across the table as though it had burned her fingers. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He only stored these moments away, each one another piece in a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. One Wednesday morning, while Laura rushed out the door with her hair pinned back neatly and her jacket pressed crisp, Mark noticed the time. She was running late, yet she had spent nearly half an hour in front of the mirror. When the gate closed behind her, silence filled the house. Mark stood there, motionless, until he found himself drifting into their bedroom. On the dresser sat her planner, a leather-bound book she had always kept meticulously, jotting down appointments, reminders, tasks for every hour of every day. Out of habit, he opened it, scanning the page for that morning. Instead of neat lists or highlighted notes, there was only a single red slash across the date. Nothing else. No names. No times. No obligations. Just a mark that cut across the page like a wound. That unsettled him more than any lipstick shade or late-night return. Laura never left her planner blank. Not once in 15 years. He placed it back exactly where it was. Heart thudding. The scent of her perfume still hung in the air. Sweeter. Sharper than before. It pressed against him, reminding him of something unfamiliar, something foreign in his own home. That evening she returned with takeout, smiling, carrying bags of food like it was a surprise gift. She launched into a story about a coworker's joke, calling them he, before quickly correcting herself to she. The slip passed quickly, but Mark felt it stick like a thorn. He smiled, nodded, laughed at the right moments, but inside he was filing every word away. The weekends changed too, where once they had made small plans grocery shopping together, visiting his parents, watching a film on the couch. Now Laura declined. She said she was tired, overworked, needing rest. She slept in late or kept herself holed up in the spare room with headphones and her laptop, giggling at something unseen. When Mark asked the name of the show that held her attention, she stumbled, hesitated, and then brushed it off with a vague answer. At night, he lay awake long after she drifted to sleep, her phone face down on the nightstand. The silence of the house seemed to roar in his ears. Every creak in the walls, every tick of the clock, every shallow breath beside him carried weight. He watched the shadows shift across the ceiling, but what he really saw was distance growing in the shape of a woman who no longer seemed to belong fully to him. The man who had once trusted routine now trusted nothing. The makeup, the perfume, the glowing phone screen, the empty planner page, they formed a chorus of whispers that told him he was losing something he couldn't name but could feel slipping from his grasp. Mark tried to act normal. He laughed when she laughed, answered when she spoke, carried on with chores, and went through the motions of family life. But his heart had changed tempo. What used to be steady was now restless, every beat carrying the question he wasn't ready to voice. Lying there in the dark, listening to the clock tick louder with each passing second. Mark Reynolds realized his peace was no longer his own. It belonged to shadows, to doubt, to the possibility that the woman he had built his life with was slowly, silently building another life somewhere else. And though he had no proof yet no undeniable evidence, he knew this much: trust, once cracked, doesn't mend quietly. It rattles. It echoes. It grows. The fortress of his marriage, once so solid, was beginning to tremble. And Mark was left staring into the darkness, wondering if the walls around him would hold, or if they were already falling. By now, Mark's world had shifted. He no longer looked at Laura the way he once did. Every word, every glance, every excuse carried a double meaning. And though he never confronted her, he began to listen with new ears. It was in the pauses between her sentences, the hesitation before she answered, the way her eyes flickered just long enough to betray a thought she didn't want him to see. She was careful, too careful. Like someone who had rehearsed her lines before stepping into the room. When he asked about her day, she responded quickly, her tone too polished, her details too neat. She rattled off office politics and project updates with a mechanical precision that felt less like conversation and more like performance. And when she slipped, calling a coworker he before correcting to she, Mark caught it instantly. The slip was small, fleeting. But once you've lost faith, even a single misplaced pronoun sounds like thunder. Still, he said nothing. Silence became his shield. If she was performing, he would play his part, too. He laughed in the right places, nodded at her polished answers, and stored every slip like evidence in a file he hadn't yet opened. But silence has its weight, and the more he carried it, the heavier it pressed against his chest. One night, after dinner, Laura leaned across the table, her tone soft but firm. She told him she felt stressed, that maybe they both needed space, just for a while. She said, so we can clear our heads, do our own thing. It'll be good for us. Mark stared at her. 15 years of marriage. And she spoke like she was pitching a weekend trial separation. Like she had already made peace with the idea of living apart. Her words weren't angry. They weren't desperate. They were tidy, practiced, almost too calm. He didn't argue. He didn't even ask why. He just nodded, letting the words settle into the quiet. But inside, something broke. A wife who asked for space wasn't a wife fighting for the marriage. It was a wife preparing her exit. From that moment, Mark began to observe more closely. He noticed how often she laughed at her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. He noticed how she'd step outside to take calls, speaking in low tones, then return with a forced smile. He noticed how her excuses grew sharper, smoother, as if carved by practice. He became a silent witness in his own home, walking through rooms where her perfume lingered like a stranger's presence, passing by doors half closed where the light of her laptop flickered against the wall. At night, when she lay turned away from him, scrolling endlessly, he stared at the ceiling, listening to the muffled tapping of her fingers against glass. His heart no longer raced with doubt. It slowed with certainty. He didn't need confrontation. He needed clarity. Real clarity. The kind that left no room for lies. No space for rehearsed explanations. That decision brought him to Daniel. Daniel was his brother-in-law, though the two were more like brothers than family by marriage. Daniel had spent years in private security, tracking assets, digging into records, even following trails most people preferred to ignore. If anyone could find the truth, it was him. Mark called late one afternoon, his voice steady, stripped of pretense. He didn't dress the story up. He didn't beg for pity. He simply laid it out: the receipt, the late nights, the laughter at her phone, the makeup, the perfume, the planner's empty page. The evidence was circumstantial, but the pattern was clear. On the other end of the line, Daniel didn't interrupt. He listened in silence, his breathing heavy against the receiver. Only when Mark finished did he speak, and his words were short, decisive. Give me a week. That was all. No questions, no judgment, no false comfort, just a promise. For Mark, it was both a relief and a torment. A relief, because someone else now carried part of the weight. A torment, Because a week felt like an eternity when you were living in the shadow of betrayal, so he endured. For the next 7 days, he went about his life as if nothing had changed. He washed the dishes after dinner, carried out the trash, mowed the lawn. He responded when she spoke, smiled when she smiled, even leaned in for quick kisses that felt more like handshakes than affection. But inside, he was counting the hours, the minutes, and the seconds until Daniel would return with something more solid than suspicion. At night, when Laura turned away from him in bed, Mark stared into the dark. The clock on the wall ticked louder than ever, each second a reminder that his life was hanging in suspension. Every creak of the floorboards, every buzz of her phone, every muffled laugh from behind a closed door was another nail in the coffin of the man he had once been, the man who trusted without question. And yet, through it all, he remained silent, not because he was weak, but because he wanted the truth to speak louder than any argument ever could. By the end of that week, Mark Reynolds was no longer the man he had been 15 years earlier. He wasn't the husband who believed in blind trust. He wasn't the father who thought a happy home was unshakable. He was something different now, a man waiting for judgment, for confirmation, for proof that the life he had built was standing on borrowed time. And as the days dragged by, one thought kept returning, circling his mind like a hawk over prey. When the truth finally came, he would not beg for explanations. He would not fight for what no longer belonged to him. He would take the truth for what it was, and decide once and for all whether his silence had been strength or surrender. Saturday morning arrived with the same dull rhythm as every other day that week. Laura slipped into her workout clothes, tied her hair back, and kissed Mark's cheek with the casualness of habit. She said she was heading to the gym, earbuds already in, her new white sneakers tapping across the floor before the front door shut behind her. Minutes later, a text buzzed on Mark's phone. It was from Daniel. "Mind if I swing by?" 15 minutes later, Daniel's car pulled up to the curb. Mark opened the gate, palms damp, throat tight. Daniel stepped out, not with his usual grin, but with the grave expression of a man carrying weight. In his hand was a plain envelope, unmarked. Ordinary on the outside, he gave it to Mark without ceremony. No small talk, no words of comfort, just a heavy silence that spoke louder than anything else could. Mark closed the door behind him, sat at the dining table, and set the envelope down in front of him. His heart pounded against his ribs like a drum. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then, slowly, carefully, he slid his thumb under the seal and pulled out the contents. Photographs. The first showed Laura in a black dress he had never seen before, walking beside a tall, dark-haired man in sharp clothes. They were laughing, leaning into each other, as though the world belonged only to them. The next showed their hands intertwined. Another, their bodies close, her smile brighter than it had been in months. And the last, the one that hollowed him out, captured them walking toward the entrance of a hotel, backs turned to the camera, moving forward together into a place that had no room for him. Mark's stomach dropped. His hands trembled, not from anger, but from the undeniable finality staring back at him. The seed of suspicion had grown into a tree, and here was its bitter fruit. This was no misunderstanding, no misplaced trust, no wild guess. This was truth, black and white, proof that 15 years of marriage had been cracked open and hollowed from the inside. Yet there was no explosion of rage, no shouting, no broken glass, just silence. A silence so deep it felt like the air itself had thickened. Mark sat still, staring at the photos until his eyes burned. Then he rose quietly, walked to the bedroom, and pulled a small suitcase from the closet. He packed lightly documents, a toothbrush, a sweater Laura had once bought him, the one he'd always liked best. He zipped the bag, carried it downstairs, and placed it by the door. Then, with deliberate calm, he laid the photographs across the coffee table, straight, visible, undeniable. No note, no accusations, no farewell. It was not surrender. It was not weakness. It was a decision, a man choosing to leave, not in anger, but in dignity. When Mark stepped through the gate with the suitcase in hand, he felt something he hadn't in weeks: control. For the first time since finding that folded receipt, he wasn't drifting in doubt or drowning in silence. He was moving forward, leaving behind the shadows of suspicion for the certainty of truth. And though he didn't know where the road ahead would take him, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would not remain in a house where respect no longer lived. 12 years passed. Time. The same force that once felt like a ticking bomb in the Reynolds household had turned into something gentler for Mark. What had nearly broken him had, in the end, remade him. Life no longer carried the sharp edges of suspicion or the heavy silence of unanswered questions. Instead, it carried laughter. It carried warmth. It carried the ordinary miracles of a man who had chosen to walk away from bitterness. Mark's story had not ended the day he left his marriage. In truth, that was only the beginning. He built a new life step by step, slow at first. Then, with greater confidence, as the years carried him forward, he met Evelyn on an ordinary afternoon in a small downtown bookstore. Both had reached for the same travel book, their hands brushing. She was the first to smile. The kind of smile that held no secrets, no rehearsed lines, just a quiet honesty. They began to talk, hesitantly at first. Then, with the ease of two people who had no need to prove anything to each other, chance meetings became conversations. Conversations became routine. And over time, routine became home. Their life together didn't look like a fairy tale. It was simpler than that. And in many ways, far stronger. Evelyn was steady, grounded. The kind of woman who brought light into a room without demanding attention. She carried her own scars, her own stories of disappointment. But like Mark, she had chosen not to let them define her. Instead, she had let them shape her into someone softer, wiser, and more resilient. Together, they built a family. Their daughter, Hannah, grew into her teenage years with her mother's humor and her father's steady gaze. The sound of her laughter filled the house, bouncing off walls that no longer carried echoes of lies. The warmth of her presence became a daily reminder that sometimes life does give second chances. Sometimes broken men can raise whole children. And sometimes love, when rooted in truth, doesn't need to be loud to be strong. Mark found himself savoring small things. Sunday mornings spent flipping pancakes with Hannah in the kitchen. Evenings reading beside Evelyn on the porch. No words necessary. Just the comfort of silence that wasn't heavy but light. He found himself enjoying the rhythm of stability. The safety of knowing he didn't need to question every smile or wonder what shadows lingered behind every excuse. He had traded suspicion for peace. And peace, once found, is a treasure a man does not let go of easily. The years had etched new lines into Mark's face. But they were not lines of bitterness. They were lines of living, of laughter. Of late nights with a crying baby, turned into joyful mornings with a growing daughter. Of long talks with Evelyn that stretched into the early hours of dawn. Noah, the man who once stared at a folded receipt and felt his life unravel, was gone. In his place stood a man who understood that betrayal could either destroy you or refine you. He chose the latter. His new home was not perfect. No home ever is. But it was real. It was steady. It was his. And that made all the difference. Looking back, Mark sometimes wondered how he had managed to leave that day with only a suitcase and his silence. But with every smile from Evelyn, with every laugh from Hannah, with every quiet evening spent in peace instead of suspicion, he knew he had chosen the right path, because dignity, once claimed, becomes a foundation. And from that foundation, he had built something far stronger than what he had lost. 12 years later, Mark Reynolds no longer carried the weight of betrayal. He carried the proof of resilience, a warm home, a loving partner, and a daughter who had never seen her father broken, only standing tall. It happened on a Monday morning. The kind of day Mark expected to be ordinary. He and Evelyn walked through the front doors of their daughter Hannah's school, talking about her report card, laughing over a joke she'd made at breakfast. They carried paperwork for the parent-teacher meeting. Nothing more. But as Mark stepped into the classroom, his body froze before his mind fully understood why. There she was, Laura. She stood near the central table, her posture still straight, but her face carried lines that hadn't been there before. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes tired, her smile thin. Gone was the bright glow that once followed her home from late nights out. What remained was a woman marked by years. A teacher now. Stacks of papers in front of her. a carefully practiced professionalism, masking whatever lay beneath. For a moment, neither spoke. Their eyes met, and in that silence, a lifetime of memories surfaced, love once shared, trust once shattered, wounds long since scarred. Laura's gaze carried weight, regret, maybe, or perhaps just the exhaustion of knowing the past could not be rewritten. Mark's gaze was steady, calm, not cruel, not longing, simply resolved. The meeting went on as though nothing had happened. She praised Hannah's diligence, her kindness, her sharp mind. Her words were professional, her tone even, but every time her eyes lifted from the page, they found Mark's, and for an instant, the air grew heavy. When it was over, Evelyn thanked her warmly, and they walked out together. Mark looked back once, just long enough to see Laura sitting alone, papers neatly stacked, her eyes fixed downward. There was no confrontation, no angry words, only the quiet truth that the past no longer owned him. Betrayal does not arrive with warning. It slips into the quiet places of a marriage, into the smiles that no longer reach the eyes, into the laughter whispered to someone else. It can break a man, leave him bitter, angry, consumed by questions with no answers. But sometimes, betrayal does something else. It remakes him. Mark Reynolds chose not to fight in the mud. He chose not to burn his house down in anger or demand explanations from lips that had already lied. He walked away with nothing but a suitcase and his silence. Some called it weakness, but in truth, it was strength, because dignity, once claimed, cannot be stolen. Years later, he did not measure victory by revenge or by watching Laura's regrets weigh her down. His victory was quieter, a warm home filled with laughter, a daughter who had never seen him broken, only standing tall, a partner who loved him in honesty, not illusion, and above all, a peace that no lie, no betrayal, could ever take away. Gentlemen, betrayal may visit your life, and when it does, you will face a choice. Will you answer with rage, with destruction, with a fight that only deepens the wound, or will you answer, as Mark did, with quiet strength, walking forward into a life where peace is the proof of survival? If you were in his shoes, what would you have done? Would you have chosen revenge or the dignity of silence? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more true stories of betrayal and justice, because in the end, it is not the betrayal that defines a man. It is what he chooses to do after.